Welcome to the Discover Your Mad Skills podcast. I'm your host, Cam Welsh. As an emeritus professor at the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary, I bring over 2 decades of experience in coaching high-performance case-solving teams. With a track record of guiding 301 very successful teams and mentoring countless students, I'm passionate about helping aspiring young professionals uncover and elevate their unique talents, what I call their mad skills. In each episode, I'll engage in insightful conversations with former team members, fellow coaches, former students, and industry connections. Together, we'll explore specific mad skills, drawing from my guests' experiences and valuable advice to empower you on your journey of discovery. Join us and start transforming your potential into remarkable skills that will set you apart. In today's episode, I have Stefano Francescut. He's a financial advisor, and just got to know him a little bit over LinkedIn, and we've had a conversation. And I think the big thing is I get a lot of students asking me about sort of financial advice and those types of things. So I thought maybe a nice podcast for these aspiring young professionals and students is really getting a little bit of an idea in terms of how they start to think about their financial futures and what they're doing now. So that's why I decided to bring Stefano on, and I'll let Stefano introduce himself a little bit more and talk a little bit what motivates them.
Thanks, Cam. Yeah, so Cam and I have been talking a bit about financial services, financial planning, and it was quite interesting when he asked me to be in the podcast. And I kind of said to him, I said, I'd love to help out young folks. I have a young family, boys in their 20s. And so, they're also professionals, engineers, things of that nature. And so, for me to help out and have a discussion like this, it's definitely in my wheelhouse, although I don't really spend a lot of time working with younger people. And we'll talk a bit about why, maybe financial services isn't geared towards younger people for various different reasons. But, I'm a certified financial planner professional and wealth manager at Next Step Wealth Management with IPC Securities Corporation. Been in the financial services industry now for 32 years. So a fair amount of experience with different types of clients, but mostly work with successful professionals and families and helping them monitor and grow their wealth and navigate the complexities of the financial services marketplace, helping them make smart choices along the way as it comes to savings, protection, risk management, taxes, and eventual estate transfer.
All right. Yeah. And I think the conversation we had was really about, as I said, you don't see a lot of these. You see a lot sort of your younger people in terms of maybe parents getting their kids talking to you a little bit. Well, I think my first question is, what do you think sort of holds back that population from even, I think, thinking about some of those financial planning things that are really important in terms of even their future 5 or 10 years out of school?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a bunch of different reasons why people don't start or they're not thinking about things. I think first of all, you don't really need to start thinking about financial planning until you have something to plan for, right? And so when you're in school, you're just working. You're through your degree. You're trying to do the best that you can. You're not worrying about everything else ahead of you. That will come. And so once you leave the financial institution that you're at and get into the workplace, then that's the time where people start to have that impetus to start thinking about various different things, whether that's goals for home ownership, goals for purchases of items that they want to, that they put off, for student loan repayments, all different kinds of, so, where there's no impetus, there's no reason why to think about it. I think secondly as well, financial services in general, financial services in Canada are designed around product sales, unfortunately. And so until there's a need for a particular product, there isn't someone out there that's going to necessarily spend a lot of time educating somebody on that product. Although I think we've come a bit of a long way, when it comes to social media, YouTube, things of that nature, where there's a bit more information and a bit more access to some pretty good financial information that anyone can grab at any point in time. It's just a matter of sifting through it all in order to get what you need and what you're looking for. And I think another reason why, people don't start, it might be generational in nature as well. It might be something that mom and dad never really instilled in a person. They did lots of other things right, instilled hard work, discipline, going to school, getting a degree, higher education, things of that nature, but they didn't know or they didn't apply financial planning type strategies and saying, these are the things that you need to do when it comes to financial planning and apply these particular rules. I don't see that very often. What I do see in some of the families that I work with is mom and dad saying, hey, you need to sit down now with Stefano because you're starting to, accumulate some funds. Maybe you're in a great example is an engineering co-op program. So you're in an engineering co-op program. You've made a fair amount of money this particular year. You've got some dollars. You need to talk to Stefano about this kind of stuff. So maybe mom and dad didn't know what to do, but they're smart enough to, move them over and say, hey, sit down with somebody, a professional that you can talk to and develop a bit of a plan for at least the short run. And then maybe that morphs into something more long-term in nature.
Yeah. No, as I told you just before we started this, I had the luxury of talking to a number of students in terms of ideation around some of their entrepreneurial projects for a course at the Haskayne School. And it was really interesting. I got to talk to 11 different students. I was supposed to talk to 12, but one of them didn't show up. And 3 of those 11 and the course would have probably close to 360 students in it. So I can just imagine what some of the other advisors saw. But 3 of those were about financial literacy. One was a little bit more about foreign students coming to Canada and helping them sort of get set up financially, which from my understanding from working with a lot of international students is a bit of a nightmare at times. But I think the other 2 were really about sort of this whole idea around financial literacy. And I think some of the discussion, and maybe you can add into this, that we had was that we don't do a really good job with students in high school to really even get them thinking about sort of the financial planning or sort of, as the Haskayne School, we've got a course that's called Designing Your Life that first year students take, and we don't do a lot of that. And I wonder if you had any sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree that there's not a lot of financial literacy type training. There is, through classes in high school, things of that nature, the career and life management courses where, they're talking about, budgeting. They're talking about, what can, based upon a particular salary, what can you afford? Kind of navigating, that type of money management. If you're making, dollars, how much can you actually spend? What can you spend it on? Trying to get kids to understand, that money doesn't grow on trees and that it's a finite item that they have to deal with. For many people, it's finite, and so they have to kind of work things out. But above and beyond that, there's not a lot of discussion about, what type of financial instruments are available in order to invest in to grow wealth. Not a lot of discussion with regards to, what type of risk management has to happen, once, there's a need for that. Not a lot of discussion about taxes, taxation, how to reduce income tax. These are higher level types of, I guess, concerns that, many people don't think about until it's time. Like I said, my first comments are, designed around the ideology that unless there's a need, people really aren't talking about it. And so I think there needs to be a shift in that world where it becomes the eventuality of the need is going to be there. Why not be proactive and talk about what a financial plan could look like? What's involved in that? Talk about some of the, rules of thumb, although I'm not necessarily a fan of rules of thumb, but, talk about, the power of compounding returns, the rule of 72. What does that look like? And if I was to ask many people on your podcast, what's the rule of 72? Some people would know it, but there'd still be some people who may not know the rule of 72. And that's a basic fundamental of, of how to compound wealth over time. And that's one of the issues that I think, many people bypass is that time is probably your greatest asset. And so when, if you could start early, educating yourself about finances in general and how to manage your own financial affairs, I think that asset of time really works to your advantage versus an individual who waits until there's an impetus to do something and is more reactive rather than being strategic in nature. That's something that, we work on our entire lives, being reactive versus being strategic. I'm sure that goes through a lot of the the skill sets that many of your people have. There's a huge difference between, to use parlance that I know, being in Q1 and being extremely reactive versus being very much proactive and mapping things out using effective tools and ideologies. And again, to go back to my other comment about maybe this wasn't taught to them by their parents, this is an attitude. This is a legacy type of ideology as well. That it's no doubt that very wealthy families in Canada stay wealthy because they create intergenerational worth and wealth. That worth and wealth comes from teaching, their children and passing along ideas that they've learned along the way on how to manage finances and how to manage their everyday financial lives. And so that's very much a legacy that can be established over time. And, I would look to mom and dad and make sure that, mom and dad are kind of building that into not just the, hey, be nice to others, be a good person, treat others the way you want to be treated, things of that nature. But it's really important to work on that financial legacy in that particular manner. You don't have to have millions of dollars to create a financial legacy. You can create a financial legacy of understanding dollars and using dollars the best way that you can possible.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. I see that the last, I guess, 13 years of my teaching career, I had the luxury of teaching a first year Excel course. And in it, we would go through and talk about sort of how you apply it to accounting and finance and risk management and all those types of things. And I think the interesting part was when we got to the finance piece, and just in terms of, I guess, the shock or sort of the opening up of sort of the eyes in terms of when we started to talk about interest and compounding and those impacts and talking about things like NPVs and returns on investments when it comes to the business side of it. But just in terms of, there was sort of a real sort of new reality that sort of come to those students. And so I think, yeah, there's not a lot of this. They're not coming in with a lot of this type of knowledge from their parents or from their primary education and those types of things. But it's really interesting too that I've been doing that long enough that I've seen a lot of students that graduate 4 or 5 years down the road. And it's really interesting in terms of a few of them sort of pop into the office and sort of say, you know what, I'm graduating. I've got so much money on student loans. What the frick do I do? And I wonder if there's sort of any thoughts that you have sort of that part of that sort of new reality that comes to them as they're leaving their sort of second nest.
Yeah. One of the toughest things, is at a very young age is using debt wisely. Anytime you can invest in education, I think that's extremely important. It's something that I was taught by my parents that, regardless of the education you're going to receive, at least the thinking was back then, regardless of the education you're going to receive, it's going to be worth something. I'm not sure if that's exactly the truth today. I think we need to be a bit more selective of the programs that, you're going to spend money on. And so that's why I say be selective, with the debt that you're taking on. Higher education, I think, is a wonderful opportunity. And if you don't have, the funds to pay for it outright, then student loans, obviously are the conduit to allow you to get that higher education. And being saddled with that student debt, moving forward after, leaving with a degree, it definitely can be burdensome. Luckily enough, if, you've got a qualified student loan, of course, there's the tax deductibility, tax credit that's associated, with the student's interest on the debt. And so that could be advantageous to help you out a little bit down the road when you start making income. But if you've got those big student loans, it's difficult to move forward with other debts, right? Because there's just only so much debt capacity that you have. So choosing wisely with regards to the next few years about the types of debt you take on, I think would be really important. You're going to pay off your student loans. It's going to take you some time to do that. Like I said, you get the tax credit for the interest that you're paying on the student loan. So use that wisely as well. You've got 5 years to deduct that interest. So you can carry forward that deduction. Sorry, I keep on saying deduction. You can use that tax credit, in that 5-year period when you start having taxes payable. So if you don't have a lot of taxes payable or any taxes payable, you should defer that credit until later on. But don't get into other forms of debt. It's one of those things where deferred gratification, you've done a pretty good job delaying gratification during a degree. And now it's almost like, the belt's being loosened, and let's go and let's start spending some money and buying some things and financing some stuff. And those types of choices can be detrimental to, to somebody moving forward, because you could be buying some things that just don't make overall sense. And so delaying some gratification and waiting and being strategic, saying it's not like I'm delaying this forever. I'm just going to wait until something else is done. And I'm going to focus on maybe getting rid of my student loans, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing. If you can concurrently work on multiple different goals, that's even better. But I find it difficult for many people to work on multiple different financial goals all at the same time. And I'm not sure if that's a psychological issue or if that's just a slicing up the pie in so many different ways that it's difficult to make any type of headway. Getting out of school, managing debt wisely, being very strategic with the types of debt that you're taking on is of utmost importance. Sometimes delaying the purchase of that new car, sometimes, or that expensive car, or whatever it may be, that's probably the way to go, is delaying it or reducing the cost, reducing the debt for that type of purchase. It would be wise. So manage debt wisely.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I like sort of that idea of goals. And I think when I talk to students, that's a lot of it comes down to sort of talking about those goals. And one example I have is a student that was really thinking about moving out. And then we had a bit of discussion, and she decided, yeah, if she stays at her parents' house for the next year or year and a half, that puts a big dent in what she can pay towards her student debt, reduces a lot and changes her goals. And I'm just wondering, in terms of advice sort of for younger people in terms of that goal setting. And I think even looking at myself in terms of, the goals over my lifespan have really changed around sort of getting the mortgage paid off, getting whatever extra line of credit paid off, saving for retirement. I just sort of talk about that piece a little bit in terms of how would you talk to them? How do you talk to your clients around that?
Yeah, I think the beginning of the discussion is all revolves around, cash flow. Cash flow is king. So whatever, money's coming in, that's kind of finite, unless, you've got multiple things that you're doing in order to create, significant other cash flow. But for many people, you're going to go from a financial institution into some sort of job, or if you're going to take the long route, you're going to run a business, or you'll be a partner in a firm or things of that nature. But that could take some time in order to step into that. But ultimately, it's about slicing that piece of the pie, whatever that piece of the pie is, and doing it in the most effective manner. For many people, budgeting is the way to go. Implementing some sort of budgeting program can be beneficial. I've always found, though, that, budgeting for corporations is much more easier than budgeting for individuals. Budgeting for corporations works really well because most corporations just really have needs. What's our need? Our need is to do this. But for individuals, it's about needs and wants. And it's those wants that sometimes masquerade as needs to get us into trouble. I would recommend that, you, rather than having a budget that's fixed, like a 50-30-20 type of ideology, many people throw around that type of budget. So 50% of your spending, that goes to essentials. What are essentials? Essentials are your rent or your mortgage, your utilities, there are your food, your clothing, the insurance. Those are your essentials. 50% goes towards that. Then 30% goes towards lifestyle. That lifestyle being, subscriptions, dinners out, travel, things of that nature. And then 20% goes towards savings and debt reduction. Now, there's some line items there in that particular budget that are debatable as to whether or not they're needs or wants. Like 20% going towards savings / debt reduction. What kind of debt did you get yourself into? If it's buying depreciable assets, that's bad debt. You need to stay out of bad debt. Buying a brand new car off the lot, although it's nice and pretty and shiny and has a warranty and things of that nature, for many people at an early age, is kind of not the way to go. You're losing money right off the hop, money that you just started making and just started earning. Better to buy something that's used, a few years older, still reliable. There are other issues with regards to that kind of stuff, but that budget is of interest. But I would turn that planning on its head. I would say more along the lines of establish a goals-based ideology first, and then fit that goals-based ideology into the budget. So work on what is it that I want to do here. Okay, I've got student debt. How long am I going to take to pay off my student debt? Well, if I know what the amount is and I know what the time is, then I know what I need on a monthly basis in order to pay it off. Same thing goes with a home ownership goal. All right, so I eventually want to buy a house. Well, based upon that house purchase price, how much do I need to set aside, to get my 20% down payment, and how long is that going to take me to do that based upon a particular return on asset, and build that into the budget rather than being spending first oriented, be goals based first oriented, so that, you're working on all the goals that you have, the house purchase, the wedding dollars that need to get saved aside, the furniture purchase, the car purchase, the debt reduction, by way of student loan reduction, those things, to build those budgets around those goals, then it becomes easier to have that clearer picture about what it is that you're going to do over what period of time. Within this period of time, I will have this goal completed. Now I can move on to another goal because my cash flow, allows me to do that. Or now I'm doing this. This is something I'm going to do for a very long period of time. Psychologically, I get used to that. And the money's just kind of gone. It's kind of like people who put dollars away into a pension long term. It's just the money goes. It's gone. It doesn't even form part of their lifestyle anymore. And you just live off the rest. So, there's something to be said about forced savings, but there's also something to be said about planned savings. But if you don't plan, then you'll never get there. I'm not good with cliches, but I think what the idea was, most people don't plan to fail. They just fail to plan.
No, and I agree with that. And I really like that idea, because when I work with my case teams, it's always been, we're looking at the clients within the case in terms of sort of those. I think the traditional philosophy is you go through the case and look for the needs and wants and sort of how do you address those. I've taken sort of more of a goals type of approach and looking at that. And I think that's been part of the success I've had with those teams, in terms of I think it's a little bit different sort of perspective in terms of how you look at stuff. So I really like that idea in terms of goals. And I think probably later in life, I think probably that's where my financial planning wound up being, is more in terms of sort of a goals oriented thing. And so maybe part of that is a bit of a maturing piece too, in terms of just getting a bit of an idea. But as I think sort of going back in terms of the students and sort of those that are just starting their careers, I think in a lot of cases, and I get this from a lot of students that I've talked to, in terms of just the whole idea around being a little bit more financial literate. I'm just wondering if you have any sort of advice in terms of places that they can become a little bit more literate in terms of financial planning, et cetera, and sort of what would you recommend in those areas?
Well, I think you kill a few birds with one stone when you go back up towards your parents and you get into the conversations. If you haven't had conversations about finances with your parents, having conversations with your parents about what they've learned, what they've done, how they've approached things. We gain a lot of bias from our parents. If it hasn't already been, passed down to you with regards to finances, maybe a discussion with them about, how they treat their finances. Not, necessarily asking your parents to give everything away, because some people are quite private when it comes to having their kids understand what their finances are. Some families are very transparent. They're like, yeah, you're of the age now where I'm not going to hide anything about our finances. This is our attitude with regards to finances. We're transparent within the family, not outside of the family, but we're transparent within the family. And, you need to know. You need to know everything that we know about our finances. You need to know about what we're doing with regards to our wills. You need to know who the executor is. You need to know, all these different things. So this is very much an attitude. So the first place I would say, go back up to mom and dad, see what they have to say. Now, the second place, you're going to get information from product providers. So financial services, as I said at the beginning, the issue that in Canada, I think primarily is that financial services are provided on a product basis. So as you stumble through the need for financial products, mortgages, debts, line of credits, investments, tax planning for your professional corporation, you're going to bump into different people providing you different services and ideas about your finances. So relying heavily on accredited professionals such as certified financial planners, relying on people that are providing you those services, not just from a sales perspective, but from a advice perspective, I think is key. If it's just about product sale, I wouldn't feel too comfortable receiving advice from those types of channels, but you might just need a particular product. You might just need something, and you don't need a lot of advice surrounding it. Relying on, your certified financial planners, relying on your accountants, relying on your lawyers, relying on those people, I think is a great source for financial literacy and financial information. And then of course, there's professionals on YouTube. There's some great channels out there that provide, some pretty good information. And sometimes that information is tied to an offer. And that's okay, because it is giving you information. It might be enough information for you to decide to take somebody up on an offer, or it just might be enough information to get you buying. Then you can corroborate that information. So part of it is a personal journey as well to get information out there. But there are plenty of great professionals out there that are putting together some pretty good content that you can get information for. Ultimately, though, there's a huge difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think many people have talked about how the differences between those three. So I won't go into that, but having the wisdom to apply that knowledge and that information appropriately, I think comes after years of practice. And so that's why going back up to mom and dad, I think is interesting, because they've been kind of through it already. And then the professionals have been through it. They were trained to do it. And so as a young person, don't just have to rely on YouTube and things of that nature. Go to the professionals, go to the people who have been through it before, and use guidance from their perspective. I'm not too terribly keen on taking advice from my peers at that age. I don't think you get quality advice. What you do get, though, is anecdotal information that you can use. But that's all part and parcel of informing yourself and having a basis of information that's coming in, and you use your wherewithal to decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. I think one of the reasons also why financial planning is difficult for many people is because it's personal. And I'm not sure if we talked about this in our previous discussion, but I say it all the time to people that, there are facts, and then there are feeling facts. And, if you're married or have, in a relationship, the difference, right? There are facts and feeling facts. And all of that's very important as human beings to understand, that sometimes, feeling facts are just as factual as the facts. The math doesn't lie, and people's feelings don't lie either. And their viewpoints and their history, whatever they're bringing with them to a discussion, to a relationship, to a business arrangement, whatever it may be, that is their reality. And so where one thing could work for one person, it may not work for the other, even though you could get to the same spot, but you might just take a different path to get there. So the importance, I think, with the financial literacy is also understanding what works for you and what makes sense for you. Because there's so many different ways to go about being financially successful, which is really what we're after here through financial literacy, is having financial success, keeping our mistakes to a minimum and being strategic and utilizing, good knowledge and implementing that in a way to get you from A to B in the most successful way possible.
Yeah, no, I really like that idea of sort of the feeling facts. I think it was around the beginning of COVID. I was in Seattle with a team of case competitors, and I was talking to one student, and he was seeing his stock portfolio at the time just plummet. And we really got into this sort of discussion in terms of, there's sort of the facts in terms of how the market's going to correct itself, et cetera. There was a lot of emotional stuff happening also at the same time. And how's that impacting what's happening? When you take that out of the equation, what happens once that disappears and sort of the corrective, stability of sort of the markets take over again type of thing. So I think that's a really interesting piece of it. I think the other piece that students talk about, and I think I get this because I'm spending a lot of time on the road with students, and we have conversations in airports and restaurants and those types of things. But one of the questions that often comes up, and I think it goes back to the idea that Canada is really product-based. And I think a lot of them talk about and sort of wonder about in terms of where they get information about a product from the person that's trying to sell that product, but they're also looking for the other information that may influence their decision of whether that's the correct product for them or not. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that piece of it.
Yeah, like I said, financial services in Canada is very much product driven. The information that you're going to get, I think you just need to go out and get and be informed. Here's a great example: mortgages. So I'll mention mortgages because many people, they have that primary objective of their, house purchase that's, right around the corner. And so when you go and get a mortgage, there are multiple places that you can go get a mortgage, and it's up to you to figure out what makes sense for you. There are various different biases. Of course, many people, historically speaking, have just gone to their bank. The mom and dad developed a bank account at this particular Big Five bank, and you've been working with this Big Five bank for forever with this particular bank account, and now you need a mortgage. So you're going to go talk to a mortgage person at the bank. Many people are saying, well, why would I go to the bank? I can go use a discount website. I can go search for lowest mortgage in Canada, and I'm going to be delivered to a particular website where I can find, the cheapest mortgage. But, sometimes, most of the time, you get what you pay for. And so if you're getting a really discounted mortgage or a cheap mortgage, you're probably not getting any type of, solid provisions with regards to pay downs, or there could be higher penalties or things of that nature. So understanding a product is key, and how its delivery is going to be provided. And then you could use a mortgage broker. So you can go use a mortgage broker where they do the work for you. They try to find the best type of mortgage, not just, of course, the rate, but also, all the little bells and whistles that come with mortgages, pay down provisions, penalty, the lower penalty fees if you break the mortgage, things of that nature. And so I think it's up to the individual to go out and do the legwork for those particular products and say, this is kind of where I want to go. There's also sources like the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, Government of Canada. There are different organizations that provide financial information, directly on a third party basis. So, if you're having questions about, what's going on there, you could go, to various different sources that just talk generically about, these particular ideas. But since you were talking about going to a specific spotted person, you could go there. I mean, there's multiple different organizations depending upon the product that you want to consider about where you would go and find more information. So you can go multiple different spots who are selling those particular products and inform yourself, and then make a reasonable decision about where you're going to go. If it's going to be directly with one bank, because there's some benefits there too, or you're going to go to a discount website to deal with the website directly, or find a mortgage broker. There's multiple different methodologies here in order to make the right decision for you. But beside that, you've got Government of Canada websites that are designed to help. I think the Government of Canada is putting more and more resources into financial literacy as well. You start to see more financial planning, even financial planning software on the Government of Canada website for retirement planning. This is unheard of 20 years ago. And so there's lots of, I think, if you start to do searches and start to use AI, and I think we had talked about the use of AI as well in these types of searches. You start to use AI now to create plans for yourself. Start to use AI to help you make decisions about the best place to go, and understanding how these products and services work. You can use AI to help you answer those questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And I think one of the things that when I, again, sort of talking to students, et cetera, that I think that's one of the things they always sort of have this wonder about in terms of where are they going to go. And a lot of them are sort of they're with their parents' bank. And so that's the first place. And I think they all sort of wonder if there's other spots. And although there are some more sophisticated students that know about that, I think that's a big question. I guess we'll try to wrap up here a little bit. And I always end these off with sort of asking sort of what's that life advice, maybe on the financial side, that you would give the 20-year-old Stefano, or someone in their shoes these days?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just someone, not necessarily just for advice for me to myself or for me to my kids, but really, looking back, I think, again, the first thing I would say is be selective with debt. You can only slice up that pie in so many different ways. And if you're forced to pay debt on things that you really don't need, then it becomes very difficult in order to do the other things that you need to do. or should be doing. And I'm not full of shoulds, but there are opportunities that are out there that if you just take the time to utilize, you could really set yourself up. Be frugal would be another one that I thought of. Don't fall into the trap of keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, right? Especially in our social media influence world today, it's nothing but, look at this and this, and this is the next best thing. And it's really hard to not get caught up in that kind of stuff. But stay frugal, be very strategic about how you're using your money and what you're spending your money on. And that's not to say that, you have to be a miser. No, be strategic. You can gain a lot of satisfaction by utilizing your money purposefully. And so I would say the second thing would be frugal. Start saving early. I can't emphasize that enough. Start doing something, even if it's small. Just start something long term, something that you're not going to touch for decades and decades as a young person. The rule of 72 and the power of compounding, I think it was said that it's one of the wonders of the, world. And so you can utilize that to your advantage, even if it's just a small sum of money. I think it was the wealthy barber that said, 10% of what you make is yours to keep. The idea there, is setting something aside and use time to your advantage. That's that one asset that you have that once it's utilized, you never get back. And so using time for your advantage to allow dollars to compound, I think is key. Here's a big one for many people. Throughout your life, you're going to be exposed to many different opportunities. There are going to be some things that come across your desk, come across, your vision or your line of sight. That could be some significant opportunities. It's okay to take some risk when you're young, more risk than when you're young than when you're older. But taking on too much risk, and I see this lately, see people taking on a significant amount of risk in opportunities that maybe are too good to be true. And usually, if they're too good to be true, they usually are. And so, being careful and selective with the risk that you're taking and understanding the risk that you're taking in these various different things that are going to come across your line of sight, I think needs to be. You need to vet these things on an ongoing basis. And they're exciting things that could come up, but make sure that you vet them and that you make appropriate choices associated to that. I wrote down one that was really interesting. I thought always use a credit card, never a debit card, and pay it off every month. I think that's overlooked by many people. One of the first things when my kid turned 18, I said, okay, now you need a student credit card. But Dad, they only give me $500. I don't care. You need a student credit card. Get a student credit card. Start using that thing. Pay it off every single month. Never run any interest and never run a debit balance on your credit card. But that helps build your credit over time, shows your worthiness, shows your character, which is also, it's not just credit worthiness that we're looking at for cash flow and things of that nature when you go get your mortgage. It's character as well that, that the lenders look at. Do we think that you're a reasonable person that's going to pay their debt on an ongoing basis? Some people get offended by that when they think character, but no, banks are going to look at your character. So they're going to look at your credit history, and they say, are you the type of person that's paid off their debts on an ongoing basis? So use a credit card, always, never a debit card. Some other advantages to credit cards as well, usage for fraud, for things of that nature. As long as you pay it off monthly, it's free money. I don't know any other situation where I can get an advance every single month, free money on my credit card. There's nowhere else I can get that. And then be goals based, not just budget based. Have those goals in place. Spend some time to talk about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Make sure that have a vision for the future. And once you have a vision for the future and you begin with the end in mind, so to speak, things become clearer. If I know that I need to set aside X amount of dollars for a mortgage down payment, I can begin that plan. I can start.
Yeah.
But if I have no clue, just like going on a trip, if I don't have a destination, any road will do. And some people live life like that. And that's pretty cool too, if you can do that. And they bounce around and they come up against things and they deal with things, and life is a wonderful journey. And that's fantastic. But having some basic goals and objectives and having a clear ideology of what you're going to do and what you need to do in order to get there, I think is sensible. And it works for most people. And then finally, I would say, what I mentioned earlier was be able to train yourself, because this is a skill. And the skill I'm talking about is delaying gratification. So much of spending money is all about to allow you to do things. And this is super important, because that's all money is just purchasing power. money isn't designed just to sit under a mattress. It's designed for a purpose. It's designed for a use. And so you need to be strategic about its use. And sometimes at an early age, you need to deploy capital, and sometimes you need to hold on to it for a strategic purpose later on. And so being very purposeful with your spending, deferring gratification for some things, not all things, but for some things, is a definite skill that can be learned over time. And flexing that muscle trains that ideology of deferring gratification. I think it's one of the things in today's world that's really difficult for people to do is delay gratification. So I think
I
those
would
are some
totally,
of the things.
yeah, I would totally agree with the deferred gratification piece. Even with myself and our kids, and probably yourself too, there's times where it takes some work to make that muscle work well. All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us on Discover Your Mad Skills Toolkit Unbarred Conversations. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you like the show, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you feel inclined, we'd appreciate it if you could leave us a like or a 5-star review. Until the next episode. Join us in transforming the lives of young aspiring professionals by supporting our podcast, the Discover Your Mad Skills Toolkit YouTube channel, and our LinkedIn newsletter at buymeacoffee.com/treadsoftly or by scanning the QR code below. Your contributions directly fuel our mission to equip these individuals with the vital mad skills that today's employers demand. Together, we can make a significant impact on their career to success.